So we recently hit 50,000 subscribers on this YouTube channel, and to celebrate I asked you for your bookish questions, and we had so many great questions come in. So thank you to everybody for asking a question, thank you for being here, and thank you for discussing great literature with so much love with me. I'm so grateful for all of you, I appreciate you being here, and let's answer as many of those questions as possible. Let's dive in. Okay, let's start with a great question from a fellow Ben who asks, how do you read books with the goal of improving your life or expanding your mind? Also, congrats, you're doing great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the great question. If we're talking about fiction, there are three things that I think are really important. Befriend the characters, take your time or introduce more time into your reading, and write around the book and write in the margins. What you want to do with great fiction is flex your imaginative powers. See everything in the fictive world as vividly as possible. See the characters as though they are real people. Now, with a really great writer, they will meet you halfway. What you're doing when you flex those imaginative powers is you're having a vicarious experience. Great novels are empathy machines. I think it was Angus Fletcher who said that in his latest book. They're empathy machines. We cannot live through enough things, and indeed we do certainly live through a lot in our lives. We're all on our own hero's journey. We're all on our own character arc, and typically people have maybe 4 or 5 character arcs over the course of their lifetime. You may be on your second or third arc, you may be on your final arc or towards the end of your arc. So when you're spending time with these characters, what you're actually doing unconsciously is spending time with elements of yourself, manifestations of yourself. You're learning things that you can take with you on your arc. Sometimes you can learn from their mistakes. We never learn things the easy way, do we? We only learn through pain and suffering and trauma. But we can learn vicariously through the pain and mistakes of other people. And literature helps us do that. It helps us empathize with other people. So when you understand a fictive person and you treat them as though they are a real person, what happens? You become much more forgiving, much more understanding in your real life. You get people. You find that you are talking to people not on the surface, because we never truly say what we mean. Real communication is below the surface. You can speak to people beyond that phatic surface discourse. And so reading great literature deeply improves your relationships. And we're social animals, so is there anything more important than that? We cannot live through enough things in our lifetime, but we can live through many different things in great literature and learn to deal with them. And so we learn to become more robust, we learn coping mechanisms, and we get to unravel different aspects of the human condition. So treat the people in a work of fiction as though they are real, which might seem rather silly at first, but no one else can see what you're doing in your mind, so you mustn't feel silly with this. Introduce time. That was my second recommendation. That means take more time with your books. If the work is truly great, reread it. Read it very, very slowly. What happens when you take more time with a book? Well, you're living in between your moments of reading, and that's what living the great books is all about. So you read, then you live. You live and you think and you love, and then you return to that book. And there's a symbiotic relationship, and everything you've experienced in your real life comes to bear on that vicarious experience too. And thirdly, write, because we don't know what we think about something until we write about it. Doodle in the margins, underline things, circle things, write little book reviews, write in a journal, write extensively about anything that captures you and captivates you when you're reading these great books. So those are 3 things that come to mind immediately for me. Befriend the characters, inject more time into your reading, and write around your books. Thank you very much for the great question. And next we have 2 questions. What books have you reread the most, and what books would you say are the most difficult books you've read? For rereading, it has to be Shakespeare. I've reread Shakespeare more times than I can count. This year I've been rereading Jane Austen endlessly. I've literally, and this is something that I don't typically do when I reread a book, when I reread I'm a little bit selective about how I do it, how I approach it. I don't reread it linearly, but with this book, Pride and Prejudice, I have literally read it from start to finish 3 times this year alone. because I love it so much. Most difficult book. Now, I would be tempted, or I think a lot of people would be tempted to say something like Finnegans Wake, right? Because it's so dense, it's so elusive, it's so deliberately difficult. But I must say that having read Joyce very deeply, I do get him, and his difficulty isn't actually much of an obstacle. Once you know him, you can be comfortable with not understanding what he's doing. I would say that the most difficult books are the ones that ask you or demand you to take action, to practically apply their lessons to your real life. For example, Aristotle's Ethics, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Now, if you read Meditations, they're very, very crisp. Those maxims, they're very, very pithy. They sound great. They're not hard to read. The difficulty comes in applying it to your life and living a virtuous life, living a stoic life. Now that's the difficulty. Okay, next question. Wandering through all the wisdom of the books you've read, what 5 quotes or ideas would you put on top? Now this is actually a really popular question. I've had a few people ask me for my favourite quotes, and I'm currently putting together a video of lessons learned from reading great literature for the end of the year. There are so many that come to mind, it's really hard to choose just 5. One that struck me recently comes from Ernest Hemingway, though of course he's giving voice to some really ancient wisdom, and he says that a man dies twice. Once when he breathes his last breath, and a second time when his name is said for the last time, and in that way some men can become immortal. And I do think that's really interesting. I've been thinking about death and what it really entails a lot recently. As many of you know, I love the writings of Carl Jung. Jung said that the very fact that we have the term or the concept of rebirth, for example, so ubiquitously in every culture means that it must to some degree exist. And so if we speak about people who have long departed, are they really departed, or are they still alive in some sense? So I love that quote, and I love that Jungian idea, and I love how Ernest Becker chose to end the denial of death. Extraordinary book, extraordinary. And he said something to the effect of the most that any one of us can seem to do is to make an offering up to the life force, so to speak, a drop in the confusion. I like that idea because it complements the thoughts of another writer and thinker who had a profound effect upon me, Viktor Frankl. Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, Frankl takes a line from Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. We've got a lot of talk today about meaning. What's the meaning of life? Does life even have a meaning? Is it all meaningless? Well, we designate our meaning. The meaning is self-evident. Sometimes we think too much, and what we really need to do is to choose our meaning. And very often our meaning will be staring us right in the face, or we will find our meaning and we will find our gifts, our talents, we will find our purpose in places that perhaps we have overlooked, really obvious places. So I really like that idea. There's another idea from Frankl that I really love, where if you take man as he is, you make him worse. But if you take him as he could be, you promote him, you make him better. I like that too. There's a really great quote from Emerson that I adore, and this one proves to be more true with every passing year for me. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. It's something to that effect from his great essay, Self-Reliance. I do an exercise at the end of every year, and I make a list of 10 things that I believe really, really strongly from all different realms, yeah? All different kinds of beliefs, but the beliefs that I find most important, most dear to me. And then I fold that list away and I return to it at the end of the next year. And without fail, and I've done this for years now, I have found that maybe half of those beliefs, or at least a few of those beliefs, change, or there is some nuance. I even start to believe things that seem to be opposite. And that's another lesson that I've learned from deep reading, is that two seemingly contradictory things can both be true simultaneously. That's a really hard lesson to learn. But what I've found is that our opinions change because we change. The world changes around us, and we want people to be consistent, and we want ourselves to be consistent, because if we're inconsistent, it seems dishonest, doesn't it? But that belief is something of a faulty or erroneous paradigm because it doesn't take into account that we grow and we develop and we mature and the fact that the world changes around us. So of course, what we believed 3 years ago is not going to be the same this year, next year. When you think about everything that's happened in the world the last few years, external to you, and then you think about everything that's happened to you, what happens in our day-to-day lives? Well, we become parents, we lose people close to us, we get married, fall in love, we fall out of love. We get a new job, we lose a job. There are so many things that will change our thinking on really important things. And I think the best skill that we should develop today or embrace is adaptability. And that means we cannot be too militant with ourselves when it comes to our beliefs. We should be very forgiving and we should be very open. Now, of course, there are some beliefs that are going to stay the same, largely the same, across the course of your life. And that's fair enough. And there are many different reasons for that. But there are a few that will change. And I think that's a really exciting thing. And it's one of the most exciting things about embracing a deep reading program that has the aim of helping you grow. So I think that's a really exciting exercise to do if you're not already doing something like that. Now, there's another quote that I really love, and this comes from James Joyce's Ulysses, which is on my mind constantly at the moment because we're deep reading it with the Hardcore Literature Book Club and we're really getting so much value out of it. Every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves. That's what I really love. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. Yeah? We're always meeting ourselves. And so I find it really useful to see the characters in great literature as reflections of ourselves, regardless of who they are, ostensibly. That's one of the great values in deep reading. And another idea that we get from Ulysses is this idea that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. Everybody knows this famous quote from Stephen Dedalus, but how do we awake? Well, it requires us to probe into who we really are, and who we really are isn't our personal story. It isn't actually our history. We identify with our pain, our suffering, and our trauma, and we don't want to leave it behind. We don't want to get rid of it because we think that we will lose a part of ourselves. But that's a really important thing to do if we are going to start healing, and if humanity as a whole is going to take a leap forward in consciousness. The highest levels of consciousness require us to leave behind our personal story. Heaven knows, however, how intensely difficult that would be. Thank you so much for the great question. Okay, next question. My new McCarthy book, The Passenger, arrives soon. Will you be reading it on release? Why, yes, I will, and indeed, yes, I did. I set this book to pre-order and I got it the day it came out. It turned up, I was so excited, I immediately sat down and started reading it, and I'm planning to do an actual full video around this one in the future, but I do read slowly, and if anyone was doubting that, if anybody thought that actually I read really fast and I clock tons of books, well, this is proof of it. I got it when it came out and I'm about 100 or so pages in so far. So I still have a little bit of reading to do before I can make that video. So far I'm enjoying it. I think it's very, very strong. It's very lyrical, it's humorous, it's poetic. I'm very keen to see where it's going so far. If anybody else has read it, then do let me know. I put a picture up on the Hardcore Literature Book Club when it came out, and it turned out that plenty of people are reading this one at the moment. So I'm very keen to hear what everybody makes of it. So far, I think it's good. It's good. Okay, this is a fun question from Brendan. If Shakespeare returned from the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns. That's from Hamlet, that means from death. If Shakespeare returned from the undiscovered country, what 3 books would you give him to show him how literature had fared since his death? What a brilliant thought experiment. I'm almost a little bit saddened that he cannot return and we can't show him. First, I would give him Paradise Lost by John Milton, and I would say, notice anything? I would point to Satan and I would say, where did he come from? And I would want to get his opinion on Paradise Lost, masterpiece. I would then give him the writings of William Wordsworth. Now, of course, the Romantic poets generally were enormously influenced by Shakespeare, and indeed our reading of Shakespeare today is through a Romantic lens still. It's still coloured by the Romantics. But regardless of the influence that Shakespeare had upon the Romantics, when it comes to Wordsworth, we see the most significant contribution towards literature and a taking of literature into a very exciting new direction. And I don't think we've seen such an enormous seismic shift in literature, in the Western tradition, since Wordsworth. So I would like to give Shakespeare Milton, I would like to give him Wordsworth, and then my third wouldn't actually be a book, it wouldn't be literature, but I would sit Shakespeare down and we would watch The Sopranos on TV. We would binge through every season of The Sopranos. I've said before that I think Sopranos is a masterpiece. It's almost like Shakespeare, the Shakespeare of the history cycles. It's almost like Shakespeare sat down with the director of The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola, and they made a television show. That's how good it is. So I would give him Milton, Wordsworth, and I would ask him, with me, to watch The Sopranos. Okay, next up we have a very popular question. This has been asked quite a few times. Who is your favourite character and why? Now, my favourite anything, character, book, food, anything, is liable to change from season to season. I always have a new favourite. It really depends on what I'm enjoying at the moment. If I had to say a static and relatively enduring favourite character, however, it would be Cervantes's knight errant. I love the quixotic knight errant. I see rather too much of myself in Don Quixote. I wish I was more like Sancho. Indeed, we probably all have friends like Sancho and we are grateful for them, but probably I identify quite a bit with Don Quixote. I also really love Jane Austen's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Woodhouse in Emma. I think they are delightful and they never fail to put a smile on my face. If we're talking villains, however, I really think that Judge Holden from Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian is incredibly frightening and really quite a complex character, and what he says is more difficult to stomach than what he does, and that's really saying something given the fact that he indulges in some of the most horrific atrocities one's ever seen in great literature. Next question from Mark. What are your favourite spiritual works? Well, I have a few of those. I would say first and foremost the poetry of Walt Whitman. Seems like a strange choice, but if you read through not only Leaves of Grass, but also his Calamus, his drum taps, if you read through Whitman, if you chant him aloud, if you take him outside into nature with you, you cannot deny that Walt Whitman is pure, secular, scriptural wisdom literature. I simply adore Walt Whitman. I recently went to a second-hand bookstore and I bought some books that were rather rare. I bought some special editions, but the real treasure was the volume of Walt Whitman that I got for £2, this paperback volume. Now, I've already got all of Whitman in many different editions, but having a really beautiful paperback that I can just slip into my pocket, thumb through, now that was really rewarding. So firstly, I would say Walt Whitman when it comes to my favourite spiritual works, and then I would probably say the Bhagavad Gita. I find that to be a really inspirational and instructive work. I would also put the teachings of Buddha, I would say the New Testament, and indeed it's really extraordinary reading the New Testament and seeing just how similar the teachings of Jesus are to the Eastern teachings. Very similar. One's reminded of William Blake's assertion that all religions are one. Yeah, I think so. I also adore Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, and of course the way I read Shakespeare is very scriptural and very spiritual, and he gives me a lot of spiritual nourishment and he helps me through difficult times. He's my go-to, quite frankly. Okay, not a question, but just a really nice message, and thank you all so much for your kind messages. They really, truly move me more deeply than I can express. Kathy says, I've just joined the Hardcore Literature Book Club. I only discovered your YouTube channel a few weeks ago when your followers were around 45k, I have no doubts you will achieve over 1 million and more subscribers. This is one of the best YouTube channels out there. I can't tell you how much your channel has given this empty nester a new purpose in life and helped me rediscover my love of literature. Oh, thank you so much, Kathy. That really means a lot to me. Okay, we have a great question now from Evan, whose channel, The Nerd Writer, is one of my personal favourites. You've almost certainly seen his videos. If not, you absolutely have to check them out. They are wonderful video essays, the best on the internet. Evan asks, who are your favourite lesser known female novelists from the 19th century? Also, congrats. Well, thank you very much. Well, I think it would be really difficult to talk about lesser known novelists with such an incredibly well-read audience. You guys are so incredibly well-read that you're almost certainly going to know most writers who I recommend. As many of you already know, some of my favourite 19th century writers, female novelists, are ones who certainly do not fit that category. George Eliot, Jane Austen, Emily Bronte, Mary Shelley, and then there are two writers who, again, don't fit that category, but it would be nice to see some more discussion around these two. They are Elizabeth Gaskell. Again, many people are going to know Elizabeth Gaskell. I've recently fallen in love with her short stories, and I've also returned recently to Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret. If you haven't read it, again, you probably have. If you like Victorian literature, 19th century literature, you've almost certainly read this incredible, sensational novel. Lesser known, okay, there's one who I came across very recently called Mary Russell Mitford. You can let me know if she fits the category of lesser known. I'm not sure how many people know of this writer. She wrote poetry and plays and she wrote novels, but the work that I chanced across recently in a countryside pub was called Our Village, and it's a collection of sort of poetic prose sketches of the countryside, going on these long countryside ambles and hikes through the different seasons. And as I've basically lived in cities all of my life and only very recently moved to the countryside, I have fallen back in love with nature. I've felt a stronger bond with the natural world, and so I found myself yearning to read the pastoral, to read rural descriptions, to reread George Eliot and Thomas Hardy. And so discovering Mary Russell Mitford was very, very exciting. She might be difficult to get hold of. But thank you so much for the great question, Evan, and I would also like to punt that question out to you guys and ask, who are your favourite lesser known 19th century women novelists? Okay, we have a great question from David, and this is a popular question as well, so I'll answer this question here. David says, apologies if you've covered this before, but I remember listening to you talk about reading certain books in certain weather periods throughout the years. I've always done that in the fall, reading gothic horror novels in October, and it really adds to the atmosphere. I remember you talking a bit about winter books. My friends and I are reading King Lear in January, based on your recommendation. Nice. But I'm wondering, what are your favourite books to read in the summer? Thank you so much. Absolutely love the channel and what you add to the larger reading community. Oh, thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. Yeah, King Lear's great for winter. I like Greek tragedy in winter time as well. So if you enjoy King Lear, then read some Greek tragedy too. That would be really good. I love Thomas Hardy in the autumn. I love Jane Austen in the autumn. I like to read poetry in spring, but summer. Summer is a comic season. And so who do I like when it comes to comedy? Well, I like to read Shakespeare's comedies, and if you haven't already checked out C.L. Barber's Shakespeare's Festive Comedy, then I highly recommend it. He says that the formula for comedy is through release to clarification. What does that mean? Well, release means that the experience of the play itself is a festive celebration. You go to the theatre, you sit in the auditorium, and you are literally celebrating a certain festival. And then clarification means you leave the theatre with a heightened appreciation of the season being celebrated. Isn't that marvellous? So comedy is wonderful for summer. It's a time in which misrule is allowed to govern. You're allowed to let your hair down, be a little bit silly, shake off the rigid working day world for a while. And so Shakespeare's comedies are really, really good. I like Cervantes, I like Don Quixote. I like to read that during the summer too, and I think that's a really good time to do so. Ray asks, if you could travel back in time and reread one book for the first time again, which would it be? Love the videos and congratulations on 50k. Thank you so much. For me, it would be Moby Dick. I would love to have the first experience of reading Moby Dick all over again. Next question, Anson says, congrats on reaching 50k. This channel is massively underrated and I can see it growing to 100k in no time. Thank you so much. This is a question coming from a student with a science background who is also interested in modern classic literature. How do you think one should balance between the study of science and the study of humanities in the current year of 2022, especially considering that we are living in an era of technological boom, but at the same time the loss of what made us human has made humanities more pertinent than ever? Keep up the good work. Ah, perfectly put. I've definitely noticed a trend of those who have a science background wanting to come to the humanities, wanting to deep read great literature. And what's interesting is I've noticed the same trend, but in reverse on my end. Obviously my background is literary, aesthetic, but I've been feeling a pull to the world of science myself. And so what I see is happening is that science, and for want of a better word, mysticism or poetry, religion, spirituality, are now striding forwards, or close to striding forwards, hand in hand. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think they're antithetical to one another. I think they have befriended one another. And I think that science today is doing some very exciting things that would have been termed miraculous or would have been viewed as witchcraft not too long ago. And so I think that's wonderful if our more delicate human sensibilities have now befriended our exploration for truth, our exploration into other worlds, our exploration into this world. But actually it's not too surprising that these two realms are befriending one another because they're both seeking the same thing. When you read great literature, in much the same way as when you read great spiritual wisdom literature, you're seeking truth, aren't you? And that might be an abstract truth, it might be the truth of the otherworldly, an ideal truth, but science is seeking truth too. And I think it's really important that we don't fight our moving forwards because it's going to happen anyway. We just want to do it in the right way. But as we move forwards and as we continue to advance technologically, we must not lose our humanity. And as Jung said, civilized man must heal the animal in himself and make it his friend. And so, what can we do? Well, we can continue reading great poetry. We can go out into nature. We can get away from the digital. We've already merged our consciousness with the internet. Yeah, many science fiction novels have detailed this in a sort of dystopian fashion, like it's a scary future that we haven't arrived at yet. We've arrived at that merging of consciousness even before the dawn of the internet, because we have a collective unconsciousness. We are plugged into one another, we always have been, but we are more plugged in and ironically more disconnected than ever before. And so how do we reconnect with humans on a human level? We spend time in the real world too. And so I think we need to make more efforts to preserve green spaces, to enjoy green spaces, to look after the animals that we share this world with, and to be really conscious about how we behave in the world. Because something that really resonated with me recently was listening to different astronauts and how they viewed the Earth when they were up in space. They looked down at Earth and they realized that when they got into space, this was a really cold realm, and there was a warm light in what was an otherwise very cold and lonely place. And they looked upon Earth with a great kindness and love, and they looked upon Earth with a dearly felt need to protect it, to protect us. And so I think science is going to help us protect our beautiful world, but that's only one half of the puzzle, and retaining our humanity is going to help us protect the world too. Thank you so much for the great question. And Crystal says, no question, just wanted to say thank you. I love your channel and all the information and suggestions. Just read The Lost Stradivarius and it was amazing. It is amazing, isn't it? Thank you so much for watching and for being here. And we've got a comment from Ollie who says, I'm 14 and I've just started reading great literature and I'm really enjoying it. I'm reading Great Expectations right now, 1 chapter a day of War and Peace. Nice. Mainly because of this channel. I was wondering how you think the reading experience differs as a person grows older. It's hard to talk to 14-year-olds about this genre, let alone reading, so I love your channel. Congrats. Ah, nice one, Ollie. I think the fact that you're 14 and you're already reading these great works is really impressive. This was around the same time that I started reading these works too, and you're absolutely right. A lot of people won't talk about these books at that age, but here's an uncomfortable truth. A lot of people won't talk about these books even beyond that age. And I found that actually we don't mature, or most people don't mature beyond secondary school or high school. But if you're reading those great books now, you absolutely will. And it's a tip off to the fact that you will change and you will grow, and I think you'll do great things. I personally remember being 14 and reading Shakespeare, and I had my fellow classmates ask me, "Why are you reading?" They weren't asking me, "What are you reading?" Yeah? "What are you reading?" "Oh, I'm reading Shakespeare." "Oh, cool." No. "Why are you reading?" Which I always thought was a bit absurd. There's a great comedian called Bill Hicks who picked up upon this in a comedy routine. That's very funny as well. The reading experience definitely changes as you grow, and what's really cool is you will see, if you return to these books that you're reading right now over the years, you will see how you have grown. Tolstoy is perfect for that, Dickens is great for that, Shakespeare is always great for that. We read Macbeth, for example, in school, and when you're young, you probably don't have the experiences or similar experiences to what the main characters are going through. Of course, you're not going to have the experience of regicide or guiltily murdering the king, but you might have experiences as you grow older with jealousy, for example. You might have experiences with not being able to sleep at night because you feel guilty about something, anything. And what's interesting is you read these works at a young age and you can appreciate the poetry, their lyrical beauty, you can appreciate the drama and the characters. But then you return to them a few years later, you bring that lived experience to the work and you think, wow. And then you do it again and again and again. And these works become your friends, these writers become your companions over the course of your life. And I think the earlier you meet Dickens and Tolstoy and Proust and Shakespeare, the better. So, nice one on reading these great books at this age. I'm proud of you. Keep going, keep enjoying great literature. You're doing a great job, my friend. Okay, Abdil asks, which book do you think is the objectively, or as objectively as one can get, best narrative or most aesthetic work of English language literature? Well, that would probably be the Geneva Bible or the King James Version of the Bible, because it is so extraordinarily influential. I don't think you can think of a more influential work in English in the Western tradition, and the prose is exquisite. Now, if we are not including scripture, then I would say the most aesthetic, or objectively most aesthetic, would be William Shakespeare's Hamlet. That's not to say that's my favourite, although I do get a lot of value out of it. I haven't come to the end of it yet, and I've read it more times than I can count, but I think anything by Shakespeare, definitely his Tragic Procession, those plays would be in the running for top spot, definitely. Dorothy says, congratulations on reaching 50k. Benjamin, I see you're already approaching 51k. My question is, how are you going to answer all these questions? Yeah, thank you, Dorothy. I appreciate that. I'm trying. I really appreciate how many questions we had come in. They're all so good. I wish I could get to all of them. Maybe I will, over the course of more videos, be able to answer these. Sorry if you've already answered this. Which great or canonical books did you not manage to finish? Thank you. Well, if a book is truly canonical, truly great, can you ever really finish them? This is something that's not, I'm not being funny with that answer. I think this is true. I think the mark of a great book, I think, is the fact that it is inexhaustible. Now, the go-to answer I would give you is Finnegans Wake. Now, I have read it start to finish, but I'm scratching the surface of that one. I really am. And I think that's a really great example of an inexhaustible work of literature. So we could say I haven't yet finished that one. Andrea says, congratulations on this incredible milestone. Thank you. I'd lost the passion for reading during university, but I've been slowly building that muscle back. Yeah, nice. It is a muscle, and we can build it back up. And if you've ever done like weight training or anything, you know that even if you lay off for a couple of years, you still have that muscle memory, and so it's a lot easier to get it back very swiftly when you return to the program. Your channel helped me rekindle that lost love for literature, philosophy, and all art in general, so I'm deeply grateful for you. My curiosity comes with regard to music, as I couldn't help but notice some amazing albums on your shelves. Do you usually read with music in the background? What are your thoughts on how music influences what you read and vice versa? I'd also love to hear about some of your favourite artists or pieces of music. I admire you a lot and I hope you will keep doing what you're doing for a very long time. The world needs more people like you. Hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much. That's really, really kind of you to say. Music. Okay, yeah, I've always been a fan of music. In fact, I was a fan of music before I was a fan of great literature. And so I've been an audiophile for a very, very long time. I don't typically listen to music and read simultaneously because I do find it a little bit distracting. I do like to give my attention completely to whatever art I'm experiencing. So I do love to sit down with an album, put my headphones on and literally just have that as what I'm doing. Music is a really interesting field to hold up against literature because we have that Walter Pater idea that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. Now, different writers will try to approximate different art forms that aren't linguistic, yeah? Some writers are very visual. Some writers are incredibly musical or melopeic, to use a term from Ezra Pound. James Joyce is a musical writer, he's operatic. And many of the anxieties of writers are to do with the fact that they cannot fully approach the condition of another art form, music being one of them. How does one approach the condition of music in words? Well, because music is beyond words, even in those works that have words. For example, opera fans will tell us that the words in an opera are not poetry. You couldn't put them down on the page and study them like great poetry. They're subservient to the music. It's the sound that has the sense and the meaning, and together that makes the art. Yeah, and so music is beyond words, even when it uses words, even when it has beautiful words, even when songs sound like poetry. It's beyond the condition of words. So how does a wordsmith approach that condition? The answer is you can get very, very, very close and then fall short. And that can be frustrating or it can be liberating. The thing that I really get from music is the fact that truly sublime music can bring you to a peak experience. The kind of peak experience that you might only get in nature. Nature at its most fearsome and awesome. And I've had these peak experiences when listening to Holst's Planets. I've had peak experiences when listening to Beethoven, his Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. I remember playing that whilst doing a 24-hour radio show and it was the middle of the night and I was tired and the sun was coming up and we played Ode to Joy and I had a peak experience and I got emotional, and that's the power of music. It can really bring you to another plane. With literature, I think it's a little bit more cerebral often. And the closest we can get to a peak experience when it comes to literature, the kind of peak experience that music can give you, I think is with poetry. And of course, again, referring to Ezra Pound, he would say that when poetry gets too far away from the condition of song and dance, it begins to decay, which is true. Recently, a few book club members have prompted me to listen to Mahler more deeply. One said that they have studied Mahler the way I've studied Shakespeare, and that's a really exciting way of persuading me to listen to Mahler. I had a peak experience recently listening to The Blue Danube. I was driving through the countryside and it was just beautiful. A peak experience awes you into silence and grounds you in the present moment. The future dissolves, and the future is an anxious realm, so we're grateful for when that realm can dissolve from our minds and the past falls away. The past is a depressive realm, and so you're in the present moment, and that's what music can do. That's the power of music, or one of its many powers. In fact, it can bring you to a new realm of consciousness, a heightened consciousness. It can intoxicate you, but it can also elevate you. But in addition to classical music, I'm a huge fan of jazz. You've probably seen some jazz albums on my shelves. I love Miles Davis. Sketches of Spain is a masterpiece. I also love classic rock. I've been listening to Bob Dylan a lot again recently. Blood on the Tracks, masterpiece. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of music. It's great to know that you're a fan of music too. So thank you so much for your great question and thank you for being here. Laurel says, congrats on hitting this milestone. Your content is always so thought-provoking and interesting to listen to. You work hard and it shows. Thank you so much. I'd love to hear your take on the idea of a modern classic. Are there any books written in the last 5 to 10 years that you've added to your personal literary canon? What contemporary authors are you watching closely? Well, of course, I think many of you know that I have a great love for McCarthy. I'm very grateful for the fact that we have such a great writer who is contemporary to us, and we're living in a time in which his works are still coming out, so hopefully he can keep bringing more out. I know he's probably not got too many more works in him and he writes slowly, but that's really exciting. My favourite contemporary writer is a Canadian short story writer and Nobel Prize winner called Alice Munro. I think her stories are incredible for so many reasons. She has been described as the Canadian Chekhov, and that gives one just a little glimpse into just how powerful her stories are. There is a volume of self-selected short stories from Alice Munro in the Everyman's Library edition. I would highly recommend you to check it out, or just pick up any of her volumes, read through them the way that you might listen to an album all the way through. They are really remarkable, and she's definitely my favourite contemporary writer. I've also been enjoying Elena Ferrante at the moment. I'm so grateful for readers who have recommended her Neapolitan Quartet. That's definitely one to check out if you haven't already. And George Saunders is very exciting. His Lincoln and the Bardo, which I think you can see behind me, yeah, you can, is exquisite. I would say that's a contemporary masterpiece too. Laurel also asks, as a novelist who writes primarily for younger audiences, I'd love to hear your take on introducing literary themes to young audiences. I loved your Classics for My Daughter video, but are there any great books or themes in great books that you'd hesitate to give to a younger reader, and why? What themes or pieces of literature should every young literary enthusiast have under their belt? Yeah, I think obviously we need to keep in mind the age of young readers and make sure that we're not recommending things that are age inappropriate, you know, like the works of, say, Bret Easton Ellis. We probably wouldn't give that to a 10-year-old. But there are really big, hard-hitting themes of the human condition that I think young readers are robust enough to deal with, so long as you give them books that are appropriate to their reading level. For example, war. We probably wouldn't give a 10-year-old Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago for many different reasons. But I would say for a mature reader, we could probably give Anne Frank's Diary. We could give The Book Thief, which is a good book. And just making sure that we talk to our young readers about what they're reading, we read with them, we make sure that we are encouraging them to read just a little bit above their heads, just a little bit, because that's where the growth takes place. Thank you for the great question. Okay, we have a great question from Sid, who says, congrats on 50k, thanks for the fantastic content. Your videos have been an inspiration for reading slow and deliberately. My question is, what are your top books of the Eastern canon? I'd love to read more outside of the Western tradition. Yeah, okay, so this is an interesting one. It's a really difficult question for many different reasons. I think I punted out the idea of an Eastern canon a bit over a year ago, and I started working on a video to tackle that very topic. And as you know, it hasn't come out yet because it's going to be a very, very long video. And part of the reason why it's so long and it's such a difficult topic is the fact that there isn't really an Eastern canon. When we talk about the Western canon, we are referring to a tradition that is composed of different countries, different languages, different cultures that have a shared cultural understanding and are connected by the backbone of influence. So for example, if you were to want to approach the Western canon, the first thing that you should read, if you were from out of space and you just needed to read something to get up to speed very, very quickly and dip into lots of different traditions, would be the Bible, yeah? You'd need to understand the Bible. You'd need to have a little bit of an understanding of the Bible. Then you would work out from there. Now, when it comes to the Eastern canon, there isn't a solitary single canon that has a shared influence, and it would be rather reductive to say so. What we can say is that there are many canons. The Western canon has a shared influence, and something that I've noticed when it comes to talking about the canon is there's a misconception that I've personally had to overcome myself, that it is chosen. Canons emerge. They emerge over time rather than being chosen by an elite group. When it comes to the idea of the Eastern tradition, however, there are multiple canons. The best bet would be to either go really, really wide, with a concession to the fact that many of those works between countries are not going to have a strong influence upon one another, a strong relationship with or bearing upon one another. A concession to that, or you can pick a country and go deep. For example, this goes to show how reductive the idea of an Eastern canon is. There isn't a huge connection between Middle Eastern literature and Asian literature. And even to say Asian literature is rather reductive. It would be better to pick a country, yeah? So for example, if you wanted to learn a little bit more about Middle Eastern literature, you'd have to read the Quran, in much the same way that you'd have to read the Bible to understand the Western tradition, or as a good leverage into it. How much would that help you, however, if you wanted to understand Chinese literature? Well, in regards to that, you'd probably need to understand Confucianism, yeah? So the Quran is probably not going to help you in regards to Chinese literature. Now, as many of you know, I spent many years living in Japan, so I took a great interest in Japanese literature. And so if I was to recommend a canonical work for Japanese literature, I would tell many readers to begin with Genji Monogatari, or The Tale of Genji. Extraordinary work, but the thing about The Tale of Genji is there isn't much discussion in English, for example, so it's really, really difficult. And it would be wonderful to correct that, and I would like to correct that myself in the future. But if you want to understand The Tale of Genji, the best resources are in Japanese. And so it's really difficult to get into that one tradition, let alone all the different traditions of the East, if we want to be reductive, that don't have a bearing upon one another. So my recommendation would be to pick a tradition that you're interested in and explore that tradition. And so what I would really love to do is put that question out to the viewers here, because the really exciting thing about the audience, the demographics for this channel, is just how diverse and varied they are. We have readers from all over the world who are excited to read and discuss great literature deeply, and I would love to invite different readers here to recommend a small handful of really profound and impactful and influential books in their countries' canon. Thank you so much for the great question. Martin says, congratulations and thanks for your work. I became really interested in James Joyce's work this year with the 100th anniversary of Ulysses. I read Dubliners in 2010 and randomly found a second-hand copy of Ulysses in 2021. Nice. I also read A Portrait this summer while in Zurich. I chose to go to Zurich because Joyce lived, wrote and died there. Not too far from where I live. I fell down a Joycean rabbit hole. Your videos on Joyce were very helpful. I'm going to read Finnegans Wake soon. Do you recommend reading any other books to prepare for Joyce's last novel, apart from his other books? Thanks. You know, there's a really great guide by Joseph Campbell. I love Joseph Campbell. His Hero with a Thousand Faces has been endlessly instructive to me. My copy is absolutely falling apart. He has a skeleton key guide to Finnegans Wake that I think is really, really useful, and I think that would be the best companion to breaking through it, because it would be really hard to just pick a couple of works for Finnegans Wake. One immediately would think of Giambattista Vico's writings. As you probably know, Finnegans Wake follows those Viconian cycles, the theocratic age, the aristocratic, democratic, and then the chaotic age. So that would be really useful. With Ulysses, my go-to recommendation is to say, read Hamlet, and maybe read Charles Lamb's The Tales of Ulysses, which Joyce recommended to his aunt because he said you needed to understand a little bit of Homer to get through Ulysses. But with Finnegans Wake, there is just so much in there that my top recommendation would be just to dive in and accrue different sources as you wade through. But definitely Joseph Campbell's guide would be a good one. Branedge asks, what are your thoughts on fantasy? Have you read much of it? Do you have any familiarity with modern fantasy? And what are your favourite stories and artworks that aren't books? Fantasy was my entrance to literature, speculative fiction generally, horror, science fiction and fantasy. It's been a little while since I've been immersed in it or been reading the contemporary stuff. Recently I've been rereading Ursula K. Le Guin. I just reread Little Big, which is magical and highly recommended. If you have any recommendations for me that are a little bit more contemporary, I'd love to hear them. Fantasy's always good, and I personally think that the next great novel of our time will almost certainly be within the genres of either fantasy or science fiction. So these are genres to pay careful attention to. But I would like your recommendations if you have any for me. What are your favourite stories that aren't books? I've mentioned The Sopranos. I think that is a masterpiece. That television series is just incredible. I like to go to art galleries. I like to walk through the galleries with no preconception of what I'm going to look at and just see what my unconscious draws me to, and when I find something I spend inordinate amounts of time in front of single works of art. I love Rembrandt, I love Gustav Klimt, I like Picasso, I like Jackson Pollock. I just like art generally. I like loads of different, Salvador Dali. Who else is good? Hieronymus Bosch, I think is really good, and I really enjoy Hieronymus Bosch. We've spoken about music. I'm a huge fan of music. I love jazz, classical, classic rock, everything really. I've had a few people ask me for my favourite film adaptations of great literature and what I think makes a great film adaptation. I would highly recommend a Soviet-era film adaptation of War and Peace, directed by Sergei Bondarchuk. Maybe I'm saying the name wrong, but that is a masterpiece. It really is incredible and a really tremendous compliment to Tolstoy's great work. In addition to that film, I really love Barry Lyndon by Kubrick. I love Kubrick generally. He's A Clockwork Orange, 2001 A Space Odyssey, The Shining. These are all really great films, but Barry Lyndon specifically is a really great film adaptation of a picaresque work by the author of Vanity Fair. That's well worth checking out, one of my favourite films. I also love Akira Kurosawa's Ran, and I think that is the best visual or filmic adaptation of King Lear. Extraordinary stuff. If you haven't seen it already, treat yourself. Try and watch it on a big screen if possible. It's really, really, really tremendous. What makes a great film adaptation? Well, yes, I think, and this is a really tall order, you need to honour the spirit of the work, and you need to be faithful to the spirit, and one needs to be careful not to impose a reading upon the work that wasn't originally there. But then, and this is going to sound seemingly contradictory, the director also needs to have a really strong personal touch in the work itself, and so it becomes a new work. So the director and the writer need to meet in the middle a little bit, to the point where it's got the stamp of the director on it, and it's got the flavour of the original. And I think Akira Kurosawa's Ran is a great example of that. It's so Shakespearean, but it's so Kurosawa as well. But a very, very difficult thing to do. I've been more disappointed by film and TV adaptations than rewarded. Shakespeare is the hardest to do. I think Jane Austen is very, very hard to do as well. Thank you so much for the great question. I've just finished Lord of the Flies. It's the best novel I've ever read. What other William Golding novels would you recommend? The Spire, I would recommend. The Papermen and Pincher Martin. But definitely, The Lord of the Flies is wonderful. Great book. Edmund says, congrats on 50k. Your channel has been so helpful for me as a guide in finding and approaching great literature over the past year. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you, Edmund. One thing I want to ask is any thoughts you have on balancing personal and more subjective criteria for what we enjoy in a book versus what we, in a more objective sense, recognise as great literature. So, objectively, I think the ultimate objective marker, though of course there's a lot of difficulties in regards to this too, would probably be influence. How influential is a work? How much has a work impacted the works that come after it, and how? Subjectively speaking, however, a real tip-off to what goes into your personal canon, what's a classic for you, is how much you want to reread a book. Those works that you cannot help but return to endlessly over the course of your life, they're going to be your subjective favourites. We can see that with single authors, and I think Charles Dickens is a great example of this, because when it comes to Dickens, there are some works that are held up as his objective bests, right? Bleak House, Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend. But fans of Dickens will have a favourite that very often isn't the objective best. They'll say their favourite is The Pickwick Papers. That's one of my favourites. They'll say, oh, I love David Copperfield, which was one of the author's own favourites. Or they'll say The Old Curiosity Shop, which Oscar Wilde had a little bit of a go at because it was a little bit too sentimental. And a good marker of what really moves us personally is rereadability. And so subjectively, rereadability is a tip-off to what moves you. Objectively, influence. But also subjectively, there are themes. We can talk thematically. There are themes that are going to resonate with us more than other people. Personally, I am endlessly affected by war themes. I'm interested in family relationships. I'm interested in death and rebirth, but that might not be something that moves other people. Now, objectively, we can still appreciate those works that have themes that maybe don't resonate with us personally. We can appreciate that the characters are brilliantly wrought. They're either psychologically complex or they're allegorical. We can appreciate that the plot is gifted to us in a really nuanced way or an exciting way or a new way. We can appreciate beautiful prose and poetry. So there are objective markers, and I think a good reading programme has a healthy blend of the objectively great and our personal favourites. And there's probably going to be an overlap there too. Jonah asks, what are your thoughts on Barthes' Death of the Author? Should we view meaning as something tripartite between author, text and reader, or is the author's biography indifferent to meaning altogether? Thank you for your great work, Ben. I've adored your channel since 3 or 4K. Nice, you've been here since the early days, Jonah. It's wonderful to see you're getting the recognition you deserve. That's really nice of you. I was asked about this on an episode of Coffee with Hardcore Literature in the Book Club some time ago, and I went rather in depth into this essay of Roland Barthes. I think we spent about 10 or 20 minutes on it and we broke it apart. I can't remember what I said, but almost certainly my thoughts have probably changed on this. I think there's an element of when you fling a work out into the world, it's no longer yours. Readers can make of it what they will. The thing with that is though that very often people will crowbar in things that aren't there. Sometimes it is useful to wonder about the writer of the work. We might wonder, who were they? What do they think of us? What are they trying to tell us? And ultimately, I do see literature as an avenue towards deep connection with other people. People who aren't even living. People whose language I don't even speak. But great literature transcends borders, transcends time. And I do feel a sort of communion with these authors who have departed long ago. And I do feel as though I know them. I think a little bit of both. We should read books independent of the author and their life, because that can be dangerous. But we should also wonder about who they were and what that tells us about who we are. Ultimately, however, when we come to the great books, we're always reading ourselves, aren't we? And so we must be careful with art criticism because it's very reflective, it's very personal. We must be careful with what we say about the great books, because if we're being honest about the great books, we're being very honest about ourselves. Robin asks, how do you best respond to or treat snobbery when it comes to the literary canon? I often find it off-putting when people disregard certain writers because they don't see them as being prestigious. Yeah, snobbery. Ignore them. I'm reminded of a story from Ray Bradbury. He said when he was little, all of his friends laughed at him because he collected Buck Rogers comic strips. So I think he tore up his strips, didn't he? Or he got rid of them. And he found that he was upset, he was sad, he was depressed. He realised that the colour had gone out of his life, essentially. And then he realised that they were not his friends. And he went back to collecting the things that he loved, the Buck Rogers comic strips. And he said, well, they're not my friends. And so I would say to someone who's being snobbish about the things that you love, well, they're not your friends. Who cares? Who cares what they think? Embrace what you love relentlessly. And don't worry about that. I mean, some people are always going to try to tear certain things down. That's not what I'm about. And I think that's not really what a lot of us here are about either. Loving things is a beautiful thing. Love generally is a beautiful thing. So if you love something, be unapologetic about it. It's absolutely fine. Pay no mind to the people who want to disparage your loves because they are not your friends. Louisa asks, could you make a video or share some tips on how an independent reader or learner, not in a school setting, can think of or find advanced academic topics for writing essays? In a college setting, a professor gives a few topics and the student chooses a topic and writes about it. How can one do that independently outside of formal academic settings? Louisa, thank you for the great question. And as you're a book club member, you will know that at the end of our lectures and our videos, we have discussion questions. And these questions are modelled on the tutorial discussion questions that we got in Oxford. And they're very open-ended and they're very good for stoking up conversation about the themes that these great books deal with. So that's a really good avenue. Those are really great for writing essays around. Another thing that we used to get when we were studying in university is we would turn up at the exam hall and we would get an exam paper with about 30 questions, but they weren't questions. They were just quotes from the book, or they were quotes from critics, they were quotes from different sources. You'd have the quote and then you'd have the word that would inspire fear in every student. Discuss. So quote, discuss. So what you can do is, as you go through the books, be really sensitive to those quotes that resonate with you or you find intriguing. Underline them, and don't be afraid to underline difficult quotes or quotes you don't understand, quotes that you feel are maybe controversial, quotes that are emotional. Underline them and then tell yourself, discuss. I think that's a great tip. But I'll have a little think about that, and I'm sure we can do a video on this very topic. It's a really good one. Thanks for the great question. Hello, Benjamin. I've only recently found and subscribed to your excellent bookish channel. It's good to see such enthusiasm for great books. I wondered if you like Sir Walter Scott. I love Sir Walter Scott. I'm going to put some footage up on the screen as I'm talking right now so you can see my recent Sir Walter Scott book acquisition. I got a haul of some of his most delightful novels and I've been tearing through them. He's a really great author, so I'm glad you're a fan too. Michael says, "Hi Professor." Hello Michael. I'd like to ask you, which non-fiction literary works do you recommend? Thanks and congratulations. I love the essays of Emerson. I love the essays of James Baldwin. I think he's amazing. I love the essays of Montaigne. And probably to no one's surprise, I would highly recommend anything by Harold Bloom. I think his aesthetic criticism is high literature. I think what he was doing when he reviewed books was art in itself. A good place to start there would be with his Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. Kathy asks, any plans to do short biographies of the authors whose books are covered? Yeah, we have a few in the Hardcore Literature Book Club. With Wuthering Heights, we had an introductory lecture which went into her life up north, her mental health struggles, her struggles with anorexia, and how Wuthering Heights was born, her relationship with her family. For Moby Dick, we had a Meet Herman Melville where we learnt what was plaguing the writer around the time that he sat down to write Moby Dick. We probed into his relationship with Nathaniel Hawthorne. So yeah, definitely, we'll have more on the way. I would also love to do some documentaries in the not too distant future that do exactly that. I would love to shoot on location, make some documentaries for Jane Austen, for Emily Bronte, for George Eliot, for Victor Hugo, Leo Tolstoy, Charles Dickens. We could go on and on and on, couldn't we? Shakespeare, of course. Hi Ben, glad to see you again. Glad to see you too, my friend. My question is this: do you think dramaturgy is alive in modern literature? Which playwrights do you like the most? Shakespeare, Shaw, Chekhov, or others? Yeah, I like all three that you mentioned. In fact, I love all three very, very much. In addition to Shakespeare, Shaw and Chekhov, Oscar Wilde means a lot to me. I like Arthur Miller. We had a podcast on The Crucible. I like the Greek tragedies. Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound is incredibly sublime. I like some of the Japanese No and Kabuki dramas. I think dramaturgy is in a sort of hibernation period. Now, that's not to say that it isn't there. There are many great playwrights writing today. My personal favourite is Martin McDonagh. Wonderful playwright, and we can see that his work ends up going into film. In Bruges, for example, he just had a new film that came out recently that I'm very excited to see quite soon. But I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a real resurgence in drama in our lifetime in a really exciting way. And if you know the history of drama, you know it's a history of ebbs and flows. The theatres shut down for whatever reason and drama goes underground. We have closet dramas and then they resurge, and then there's censorship, there's things that are prohibited, you can't say this, you can't say that, and so you have to be innovative when it comes to drama. And then drama really responds to the social conditions of the world. War, for example, that has a big influence on drama. And so I think we will see a resurgence in drama, and I think we're going to see some very exciting things. I think we are hungering for it now more than ever before in our lifetime. We are hungering for a return to the theatrical world, and this can be a whole video in itself. I've got many different reasons for my belief in this, but I think the best thing we can do to prepare is to immerse ourselves in drama, in the theatrical, and get ready for a wild ride, because we're going to see some special things. How do you feel about translations? Have you ever learned a language just to be able to read something in the original, or used a famous text you knew in translation to learn the original language? I learned English by learning Shakespearean monologues. Wow, that's really impressive. Nice one. Yeah, so the reason I decided to start learning Latin is for the literature. That's a great reason to learn it. The first language I learnt was German, but I can't speak it anymore. I would love to revive my German ability, but it's been dormant for a while. I learnt German when I was very, very young because we went on lots of trips to Austria. And one of the joys of learning German was being able to read Thomas Mann and Goethe in the original. And I also wrote my own poetry in German. It was probably incorrect, but just for the fun of it. So that was good. I learnt Japanese because I was living in Tokyo and Yokohama for a while. And then I came to the literature afterwards. And there's a really rich literary tradition in Japanese that's well worth exploring. But in the future, I think I will be learning languages primarily for their literature. As for translations, I'm a real advocate for doing taste tests and shopping around. I think the translator is an artist in their own right. Yeah, I love good translations. It can be really fun when you fall in love with a work of literature to reread it with a different translation each and every year. Now, if you come to a work of literature that you cannot abide and it's in translation, you probably have a bad translation, and so it's worth finding a new one. It's difficult being beholden to a translation, but it is also very exciting to know that there's a huge, wide world of literature out there that you can explore when you fall in love with a literary tradition. Julia asks, do you think we've exhausted the analysis of Shakespeare's plays? Is there still things to be said about his works? I want to study him for my masters, but I'm unsure. I love your channel. Wish you the best. Thank you, Julia. I think I personally haven't exhausted Shakespeare. I always find something new, and I think he is still teaching us many things that we can take into the modern world today. I think in academic circles there are some approaches to Shakespeare that have run their course. Personally, I think Shakespeare is quite endless, but I would love to know how you get on with your masters. You'd love to study him? Let us know which direction you decide to go in. Declan says, hi Benjamin, I absolutely love your videos. I have 2 questions. First, as someone who will be taking the ELAT in 2 weeks, I was wondering if you had any tips to manage test-taking anxiety. Second, is there a particular poem that has impacted your life significantly? Well, Declan, because it's been a little bit of time since you asked this question, you've already taken the ELAT, which is the English Language Admissions Test for Oxford and Cambridge, and I have been told that it was an okay paper this year, and it was about sleep. Am I right? So let us know how you got on, and this advice will be for tests that you will be taking in the future. I think the best thing to do when taking a test to ameliorate your anxiety is make sure you don't study the day before. Just relax. Yeah, don't do any cramming, don't study, get a good night's sleep, eat lots of food, do exercise, do something fun, look after yourself. And then in the morning, you might want to do some mindfulness techniques, some breathing. And when you get into the exam, take your time, yeah? You have all the time in the world. Even if you have a timer, of course you will, tell yourself you have all the time in the world. Read that question carefully. And if you need to annotate, annotate liberally. And then go into robot mode and tell yourself, right, I'm going to write 3 main points. So go searching for those 3 main points and then go even further into robot mode and break those 3 points down into a reliable and memorable structure. Point, example, explanation. Point, example, explanation. So those would be my tips. Try to relax as much as possible. Make sure that part of your test-taking prep involves drilling structure, so you can rely on that structure when you get into the test. Also, taking practice tests, I'm a huge advocate for that. I think that's a really good thing to do. A poem that has impacted me. Well, the poem that got me into poetry is John Donne's A Nocturnal on St. Lucy's Day Being the Shortest Day. That was the poem that I thought, wow, poetry can do that? And then I was away. I was smitten. Okay, we have a great question from Wesley. Hi Ben, congratulations on the milestone. You've mentioned running and marathon training in previous videos, and I'm just wondering, how do you see running, long distance running in particular, connecting with reading and literature? How do you think the mindsets of endurance running and reading big books relate? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on how the 2 very different activities might be psychologically connected. Also, any running related books, novels you could recommend. Love your channel and love hearing your thoughts from an avid reader and endurance runner. What a great question. Thank you, Wesley. Yes, Haruki Murakami has a great collection of essays called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. That will make anybody want to start running marathons. It will make anyone who reads that collection want to start writing. And it will probably make you want to open your own jazz bar in Tokyo. I personally see a lot of parallels between long distance running and reading big books. They're both about endurance, aren't they? Now, when I first started running, I was training in Hyde Park and I got winded very easily. I would do one lap and I'd get winded, I'd get a stitch, I'd have to bend over and catch my breath. But what I found was when you push past that difficulty, you get a second wind and you get a runner's high and you get this burst of endorphins. And I see a lot of parallels in regards to that and reading big books. Now, some books are really difficult to get into, but if you hit your stride and you get the pacing right, because when it comes to marathons, you can't sprint it, you have to get into a really good, reliable rhythm that's personal to you, and you're also not really competing with other people, are you, when you run? You're only really competing with yourself. It is ultimate self-improvement. Runners are great people. Runners are all so happy for other runners when they set their personal best, whatever that might be, even if it's not objectively great. Runners are always so happy when it comes to that. And I think lovers of literature can be like that too. We're so happy when somebody comes to a big book like Tolstoy's War and Peace or Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Regardless of who you are, what your background is, how much you've read, you push through that difficulty, you find your rhythm, your pace, and you grow. And you get that runner's high, or you get that reader's high, don't you? So I think there are a lot of parallels there, and definitely I think a few people have probably been able to tell that a lot of my mindsets in regards to reading do come from physical exercise, whether that be running, weight training, training of all kinds, really. So thank you so much for the great question, Wesley. Hi, Benjamin. I really enjoy your videos because your passion for literature brings out my own. I'm curious to know if you have any plans to write your own book one day. I would also like to know your favourite poem. Thank you for the informative videos. I've been enjoying your podcast on my bus rides to university every morning. Sending warm wishes from Canada. Samran. Ah, thank you so much. My favourite poem at the moment is Feste's Song from the end of Twelfth Night. Incredible. It sends a chill through me. Plans to write my own book. I would really love to write a book of criticism, and I'd love to write a book on Shakespeare. And so that will be in the pipeline in the future, most definitely. Next question. Should I wait until the beginning of the year to join the book club? I would say if you're interested in any of the books we're reading at the moment or the back catalogue reads, which are still attracting vibrant discussion, then you can join anytime you like. We've read so many great books and we are going to continue to do so. We've read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Austen, Hugo, we've read Emily Bronte, George Eliot, Shakespeare, but of course we do have next year's schedule coming out very soon and it's very exciting. So you can join whenever you like and it's always a great time to join and you will be very warmly welcomed. Do you plan or have you read anything from George Eliot besides Middlemarch? Also, congrats on 50k, thank you very much. Yeah, I've read almost everything from George Eliot. She's fantastic. The Mill on the Floss and Silas Marner would have my vote for next steps after Middlemarch if you're a fan of Eliot like me. Alice says the books you talk about are classics. Not that that's bad or anything. Do you like any books that are more recent? As I mentioned a little earlier, I absolutely adore Alice Munro. I love George Saunders. I love Elena Ferrante. I of course love Cormac McCarthy. Next question. What would you like to contribute most to the world of literary criticism? A message of love, harmony, and healing. I was surprised to hear you regard Moby Dick so highly. Can you expand on its virtues? Wasn't my cup of tea, but I can't help but think I'm missing something. Yeah, we have a really long, involved, in-depth lecture series on this book that guides you all the way through it. But I love Moby Dick. I think it's one of those books where it really depends on when you are coming to the work. And I've definitely had those works where it just wasn't the right time in my life. Yeah, Jane Austen was a big one. Ulysses was one that took me a while to really get into and really appreciate. And it really does depend on where you are. Moby Dick is brilliant for those times when you're on the cusp of an important journey. And maybe you're about to experience some difficult growth or pain. And ultimately, I think it's this brilliant, epic prose poem masterpiece. It's lyrical. and it's really philosophical, it's really profound. Ray Bradbury said that Shakespeare wrote Moby Dick using Melville as a Ouija board, and that about sums it up for me. That's why I love it. But hey, if it's not for you right now, I would say put it on the shelf for a bit, come back to it in a few years. Maybe keep it in the back of your mind for a time when you're going through some difficulty. And next time you're going through a difficult period, pick it up and see what you think. Lisa says, which books are your go-to stories when the world gets you down? And have you ever read The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova? Yeah, I read that when it came out and enjoyed it. My go-to stories are the novels of Jane Austen, the novels of Thomas Hardy, the novels of George Eliot, and Cervantes's Don Quixote, and of course Shakespeare as well. Eric says, I will be teaching Introduction to Literature for the first time at a community college. I've chosen the stories, plays and poems we'll be covering, but I'm still trying to choose a novel. Any suggestions for a novel that would interest my mostly male, rural students, but would still lend itself to deeper discussions? Ooh, that sounds like Stoner would be good. Yeah, Stoner sounds like it would be right up their street. I would actually recommend Middlemarch by George Eliot. It's a study in provincial life, endlessly relevant across countries, across times, relevant to everybody. Such a tremendous story, and I think your students would get a lot out of that one. And I think we'll leave it there for today. I told myself I would keep going until my voice gives out, and you might be able to hear it's become a little bit hoarse. Thank you so much for your great questions. There are so many more that I wish I could have gotten to. If you enjoyed this video, we can definitely do a part 2 and we can get to some of those questions. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate you being here. I'm so grateful that we have such a lovely little community of lovers of literature, and I'm so grateful that we can have these sorts of discussions. Thank you again for your great questions, and thank you for spending some time with me talking about books. Have a lovely day, everybody, and happy reading. Bye-bye for now.